What if a boy died more than 1,000 times, and every single time, he chose to get back up anyway? Stick around, because by the end of this story, that same boy stares down a horde of monsters, and refuses to fall. This is the story of 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓, a name that means nothing at first, and everything by the end. He grew up in a small village, raised on nothing but dirt roads and quiet nights. A retired mercenary lived nearby, and one day, he put a sword in 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓's hands. The old man watched him swing, and something in his eyes changed. He said the boy had real talent, the kind that could carry him all the way to knighthood. From that single sentence, a dream was born. 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓 wanted to become a knight, the kind who could end a war with one blade. So he packed what little he had, and left the only home he'd ever known. He wanted glory. He wanted purpose. He wanted to matter. But the world doesn't care what you want. Fast forward, and 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓 is standing in a bar, listening to grown men laugh at him. They mocked him, called him a joke, said a coward like him could never wear a knight's cloak. That was the day he learned something brutal. His talent wasn't special after all. It was average, painfully average. Still, he refused to quit. He told himself effort could close any gap. So he kept training, kept fighting, kept believing. Then one day, 12-year-old boy beat him in a duel without even trying. A single strike sent his sword flying, and the tip buried itself in his stomach. In that moment, his dream shattered into pieces. He asked himself if there was truly no way out for someone like him. But despair only lasted a night. The next morning, he was back at the tree stump, swinging his sword until his arms shook. Hour after hour, day after day, he chose experience over talent. If he couldn't be the strongest, he decided, he would become the most stubborn. 3 years passed like that, one repetitive swing at a time. And somehow, that stubbornness earned him a title, commander of the weakest squad in the army. It wasn't glory, but it was something. And soon, that something would be tested on a battlefield soaked in blood. Thousands of swords were about to clash, and his squad was standing right in the middle of it. He sparred with a friend the night before, sensing just how outmatched they truly were. Then the horn sounded, and the war began. 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓 fought like a man who refused to stop moving, dodging blades meant for his throat. He blocked an arrow meant for a teammate, then turned and cut down the archer's ally instead. Finally, he locked eyes with the one soldier he'd sworn to kill. This was the enemy who had haunted him since childhood. He remembered advice from a teammate: keep your eyes open, even with a blade at your throat. Death should never make you flinch, because fear only makes you weaker. So he watched the strike come, and for the first time, he dodged it. He turned for a counterattack, believing this was finally his moment. But the enemy twisted his grip at the last second, and drove a blade straight through his neck. Blood poured out, and his body hit the ground. Then a boat appeared, and a boatman told him to give up gracefully. 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓 smiled instead, and told him that day would never come, because this wasn't his first death, or his second, or even his third. This was his 20th time dying on this exact battlefield. Somehow, he was trapped, reliving the same war over and over again. Every morning began the same way, the same pans clanking, the same enemy waiting, and every single time, that same blade found his throat. By his 33rd life, he noticed a necklace slip from his collar as he fell. It reminded him of a mercenary job long ago, protecting a village from monsters. The village elder had given him a strange charm, claiming it could grant a desperate wish. Now, he started to wonder if that joke of a gift was the reason for his endless loop. Whatever the cause, he decided, the wish had already been made. So instead of despairing, he chose to train inside the loop itself. He asked his friend Rem to teach him something called the heart of the beast. It was a technique that let him read an enemy's swing before it landed. Rem struck without mercy, and 𝗕𝗙𝗓𝗓 died again, and again, and again. But every death chipped away at his fear, one repetition at a time. By his 111th life, it still wasn't enough. By the 123rd, that same blade still found his throat. Then finally, on a night that felt no different from any other, something clicked. He forced Rem's axe back using the same thrust that had killed him so many times before. His hand was bleeding, but he was laughing like a lunatic. He had finally mastered the stab that had ended his life over 100 times. The next battle, he stepped onto the field, ready to finally break through. This time, when the blade came, he saw it, and he stopped it. The enemy who had haunted him for so many lifetimes finally fell. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 felt something break loose inside his chest, a wall he had been beating against for years. He realized this endless death wasn't a curse, it was a gift disguised as suffering. Every failure became fuel, and every wall became something worth climbing. From that point forward, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 stopped seeing the loop as punishment. He started seeing it as the only training method no ordinary soldier could ever access. While others improved slowly, he could die 100 times to master a single movement. That mindset alone would carry him past every enemy the world threw at him. His squad noticed something different in his eyes, something sharper, something unshakable. Rem grinned and called him crazy, but there was pride buried underneath the insult. And this was only the beginning of what 𝗕𝗙𝗚 would survive. Assassins, monsters, magicians, and rivals were all waiting, hidden in the days ahead. None of them knew what kind of storm was coming their way, because a man who has already died 100 times has nothing left to fear. So let's watch him climb, one impossible wall at a time. Not long after that victory, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 noticed something was wrong with the days themselves. The same conversations kept repeating, word for word, morning after morning. He realized he had slipped into a brand new loop, one hidden inside the barracks. Somewhere in the dark, an assassin was killing him in his sleep. Night after night, a poisoned needle found his throat before he could even scream. He discovered the attacker was moving with terrifying silence, impossible to hear or see. So he turned to his squadmate, Jackson, a soldier who could hear a falling leaf from a rooftop. Jackson explained that sound spreads like a wave, and a trained ear can separate one voice from 1,000. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 sat still for loop after loop, forcing himself to listen past the noise of the camp. He learned to isolate a single bird landing on a flag, then a single footstep in the grass. Slowly, painfully, his hearing sharpened into something almost unnatural. Then one night, the assassin struck again, and this time, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 heard him coming. He grabbed a hidden blade and struck back before the poison could reach him. It turned out the real target wasn't him at all. It was a quiet squadmate named 𝗕𝗙𝗚. And standing behind the assassin was someone far more dangerous, the company commander herself. She hadn't come to kill them, though. She had come to protect 𝗕𝗙𝗚 from the shadows. Together, they burned the evidence and buried the truth in ash and smoke. That fight taught 𝗕𝗙𝗚 something new. Some walls couldn't be broken with a sword alone. Sometimes survival meant sharpening senses he never knew he had. With that lesson behind him, life on the battlefield finally began to feel normal again. But normal never lasted long for a man cursed with endless second chances. Soon, his commanders assigned him to something far more dangerous. A scouting mission into enemy territory. A green sea of grass stretched out before them, tall enough to swallow a man whole. The squad leader, a hot-headed soldier named Andrew, insisted on pushing straight through. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 warned him it was a trap, but nobody listens to the lowest-ranked soldier. The moment they stepped into the grass, arrows rained from every direction. It was an ambush, and 𝗕𝗙𝗚 died again and again, watching his squad get torn apart. Each loop, he learned a little more, where the archers hid, where the spearmen waited. Eventually, he stopped trying to escape the ambush, and decided to challenge Andrew for command instead. One punch to the stomach was all it took to prove who truly belonged in charge. From there, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 guided his new squad through the enemy's blind spots, like he already knew the future. Because in a way, he did. He used every death as a map, every failure as a warning sign for the next attempt. Slowly, the group he once thought were strangers became something closer to family. Even Andrew, once arrogant and cruel, began calling him captain without hesitation. Together, they slipped past enemy patrols, burned a hidden camp, and escaped with almost everyone alive. For the first time, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 brought back more survivors than any previous loop. It still wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and progress was everything to him. Not long after, the real war exploded across the tall grass fields. a strange fog rolled in, swallowing the entire battlefield in seconds. Enemy archers hidden inside the mist unleashed a storm of arrows on blinded soldiers. It was called the Fog of Annihilation, a spell built from the blood of countless beasts. 𝗕𝗙𝗏 quickly realized the fog was tied to a flag planted somewhere in the chaos. Destroy the flag, and the fog would disappear along with it. Problem was, there were 5 decoys scattered across the field, each one a perfect copy. He died to the wrong flag, and the wrong flag, and the wrong flag again. Loop after loop, he narrowed the possibilities down, learning the shape of failure itself. Finally, he found the real one, and standing beside it was a man named 𝗕𝗓𝗏. 𝗕𝗓𝗏 was a genius swordsman, cocky, talented, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. 𝗕𝗙𝗏 barely lasted a few exchanges before losing over and over, life after life. But something strange happened. Every fight against 𝗕𝗏 made him just a little bit sharper. By his 18th clash, the world around him began to fade until only the blade remained. That focus was a technique called concentrate on a single point, and it changed everything. On his 48th encounter, he could enter that state whenever he wanted. Finally, blade met blade, and 𝗕𝗙𝗏 read 𝗕𝗏's every movement before it happened. 𝗕𝗏's pride cracked the moment he realized this so-called weakling had surpassed him. 𝗕𝗙𝗏 struck him down, and the fog finally lifted from the battlefield. But victory brought a new threat, the leader of the enemy elites, a man called Grey Dog. 𝗕𝗙𝗏's short blade barely survived the exchange, cracking under the sheer weight of that man's strength. Just as death seemed certain, wounded Lake Panther leapt in to defend him. That beast would become a strange, loyal companion, following him from that day forward. Backup finally arrived, and the enemy retreated, leaving 𝗕𝗙𝗏 battered but alive. Word of his role in breaking the spell spread across the entire camp. Soldiers who once mocked him now whispered a brand new nickname, the Spellbreaker. For a man who had spent his whole life feeling invisible, that title felt like the first sunrise. But titles alone don't win wars, and 𝗕𝗙𝗏 knew he still had far to climb. So he set his sights on something simple, moving up through the army's ranks. Soldier after soldier stepped up to challenge him, expecting an easy victory over a nobody. Instead, he broke their swords, broke their fingers, and broke every assumption about who he was. Word spread fast, and even a special ranked border guard named 𝗕𝗏 stepped up for a duel. Their fight ended in a dead-even standoff, and mutual respect neither one expected. 𝗕𝗏 offered him a place among the elite border guards, and 𝗕𝗙𝗏 gladly accepted. But before the celebration could settle, 4 assassins ambushed him during a routine patrol. Every death taught him something new about a weapon called the whistle dagger. It moved faster than sound, invisible until it was already buried in flesh. Loop after loop, he learned to read the thrower's hand instead of the blade itself. Eventually, he turned the tables completely, throwing whistle daggers of his own. One by one, the traitors and their hidden killer fell to his blade. Even the ferry commander grew suspicious of his impossible instincts, though she never got a straight answer. Meanwhile, back at camp, 𝗕𝗙𝗏 kept training under a giant of a soldier named 𝗕𝗏𝗏. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 taught him that martial arts were built on a body strong enough to survive anything. Boulders, one-armed lunges, punishing repetition, all of it built the frame beneath his blade. Then a swordsman named 𝗕𝗏𝗏 took over his training, tearing apart every bad habit he owned. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 forced him to throw away everything he'd learned and start completely from zero. Basics, grip, stance, balance, all of it had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Loop by loop, 𝗕𝗙𝗏 absorbed lessons most soldiers would need years to understand. Somewhere in the middle of that training, a strange, curse-bound woman began following him in secret. Her name was Esther, and she had been turned into a beast by a magical curse of her own. She began watching over him, quietly healing the damage his relentless training left behind. Without her noticing, she'd found herself tangled in the life of the strangest human she'd ever met. Meanwhile, a new threat surfaced closer to home, a tunnel hidden beneath the shoemaker's house. The shoemaker begged him to investigate, certain something terrible had taken his missing wife. 𝗕𝗙𝗏 stepped into the tunnel, and a wave of magical fire burned him to ash in an instant. Loop after loop, he learned the killing intent of every hidden trap, one careful step at a time. After dozens of failed attempts, he finally sensed danger before it struck, and survived the maze. Deep inside, he found something far worse than traps. A magician experimenting on captured villagers. Among the corpses was the shoemaker's missing wife, already beyond saving. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓's fury boiled over, and he charged the magician despite every warning in his head. An invisible barrier deflected his attacks, until a blessed vest Esther gave him shattered the spell completely. His blade split the magician clean in half, ending the nightmare beneath the city. He never told the shoemaker the truth, letting him keep hope instead of grief. Sometimes, he realized, protecting people meant carrying their pain so they wouldn't have to. With that wall behind him, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 returned to simpler battles, hunting monsters alongside his squad. A flock of harpies once wiped out his mercenary group long before this war began. This time, he tore through them without hesitation, refusing to let history repeat itself. His growing strength earned him a promotion, platoon leader of his own independent unit. The fairy commander teased him constantly, calling herself his fiancée just to watch him panic. Life almost felt peaceful, until a new mission arrived, one that would test him harder than ever. He was sent alongside Torres and a sharp-tongued ranger named Pen into enemy territory. Their target was a fortress city called Crossguard, and a missing spy trap somewhere inside. The first attempt ended in an ambush, a trap set specifically for people like them. Loop after loop, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 tested every possible route into that city. Smuggler tunnels led straight into Greyhound soldiers waiting in the dark. Climbing, the outer wall led straight into a magician wielding living vines made of thorned roses. The disguised merchant route seemed calm till werewolves tore his allies apart in the moonlight. Every failure felt heavier than the last, but 𝗕𝗙𝗚 refused to let a single wall stop him. He began combining lessons from every failed attempt into one impossible plan. He provoked a captain named Roger by mocking his bald head in front of his own men. Furious and humiliated, Roger charged blindly, giving 𝗕𝗙𝗚 the opening he desperately needed. A werewolf alpha tore Roger's head clean off before the fight could even finish. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 turned and faced that same alpha, and this time, he ended it for good. With chaos surrounding him, he broke through to the wall, and finally reached the magician Rakia. Her vines nearly crushed him until he unleashed stolen magic devices, blinding her with a burst of light. The fog of confusion cleared just long enough for his blade to finish the fight. Inside the city, they found their missing spy already dead, the whole mission a trap from the start. Instead of despair, 𝗕𝗙𝗚 set a building on fire, using chaos to cover their escape. They barely made it back to friendly territory, exhausted, wounded, but finally, alive. Waiting for him back home was a desperate friend named 𝗕𝗏𝗧, tangled up with something far more dangerous. A creature known simply as a frog had captured him, testing the loyalty of his entire crew. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 marched straight into that danger, whistle daggers ready, refusing to let a friend die alone. The battle against that frog, whose name turned out to be Merlin, pushed him past every previous limit. Blade against blade, fist against claw, neither side gave an inch. Just as Merlin prepared the killing blow, something stopped him cold. A warning from Esther's true form. Merlin sensed a power in her far beyond an ordinary curse-bound beast, and chose to walk away instead. 𝗕𝗙𝗚 was furious the fight ended early, but grateful to still be breathing. He knew, deep down, that Merlin was a wall he hadn't fully broken yet, and somewhere out there, that frog was already promising a second, deadlier meeting. For a moment, life allowed him rest, training with 𝗏𝗏 in secret under moonlight. 𝗏𝗏 revealed something forbidden, an divine healing power called divinity, hidden from the church that once bound him. He used it to mend 𝗕𝗙𝗚's wounds, breaking every rule he'd sworn to follow. It was a quiet act of loyalty from a man who rarely showed his true heart. Soon after, war reignited. An Aspen soldier stormed the camp using a lake as cover. Leading them was a familiar face, Mitch, hungrier and angrier than before. Because 𝗕𝗙𝗚's wrist was still healing, Mitch's blade found him easily this time. Two loyal squadmates threw themselves in front of that blade, and both of them died for it. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 watched helplessly as everyone he tried to protect fell in front of him. Waking up in another loop, he made a brutal decision. Rebuild his entire fighting style from his left hand. It meant throwing away 30 years of muscle memory and starting from absolute zero. Every meal, every stretch, every swing, he forced himself to relearn with his weaker side. A squad mate named 𝗕𝗔𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗙 challenged him to countless duels, unknowingly helping sharpen that fragile new skill. Loop after loop, his left-hand swordplay grew from clumsy and hesitant into something dangerously precise. On his 112th attempt, he finally faced Mitch, fully rebuilt, fully ready. Mitch fought with everything he had, but 𝗕𝗏𝗏 abandoned pure swordplay for a brutal, desperate brawl. Fists, throws, broken bones. Nothing was off the table anymore. Mitch's ankles shattered under his grip, and the duel he wanted so badly slipped through his fingers. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 picked up Mitch's fallen sword and ended the fight he never truly wanted to finish. He respected Mitch as a swordsman, even as he drove the blade home. War, he reminded himself, never leaves room for mercy, no matter how much respect remains. With one more wall behind him, 𝗕𝗏𝗏 claimed Mitch's sword, choosing to wield 2 blades from that day forward. Back on the front lines, a monstrous giant crashed through the enemy formation, crushing everything in its path. Rem stepped forward without hesitation, unleashing a technique called Heart of the Superhuman. His muscles surged with impossible strength, and he traded blows with the creature 3 times his size. Watching that battle lit a fire in 𝗕𝗏𝗏, a desperate hunger to learn that same power. Elsewhere on the field, an old enemy resurfaced. The traitor who once murdered his mercenary comrades. Old wounds reopened as 𝗕𝗏𝗏 remembered every friend he'd watched die because of that man's betrayal. This time, there was no fear left in him, only cold, focused resolve. One clean strike ended a grudge that had haunted him since long before the loops even began. Ragnar followed with his own display, cutting down 3 enemies in a single fluid motion. He named the technique on the spot, proud of a move he'd never had to use before. Meanwhile, 𝗏𝗏𝗏 transformed into an unstoppable force of his own, laughing as he sent soldiers flying. The battlefield had become a stage for every soldier 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 had ever trained beside. Watching his squad fight like equals against monsters and men alike filled him with quiet pride. That night, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 asked Rem to teach him the secret behind Heart of the Superhuman. Rem warned him the technique could burst his heart if pushed even slightly too far. Naturally, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 decided the only way to learn it was to push exactly that far. Loop after loop, his heart exploded, blood pouring from his mouth as his vision faded to black. Rem hated every second of it, but obeyed anyway, unable to refuse a direct order from his captain. After more than 100 agonizing deaths, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 finally learned to control that impossible power himself. He drove a sheathed blade straight into solid rock, and shattered it without even drawing steel. His body paid a brutal price afterward, barely able to move for an entire day. Still, he considered it worth every second of pain. One more wall broken forever. With that power mastered, he threw himself fully into fighting with 2 swords at once. Most swordsmen avoided dual wielding entirely, calling it reckless, unstable, impossible to master. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 didn't care what was possible, he only cared what felt right in his hands. The rest of the war carried on in a blur of hit-and-run raids and enemy hunters. A deadly sniper known as the Claw of the Hawk had been picking off soldiers from a distance. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏's squad baited him into a trap, using themselves as living targets to draw him in. Rem tracked him through pure sound alone, hunting him down like prey in the forest. With the sniper gone and the enemy's plans collapsing, the tide of the entire war finally turned. A daring gambit at crossguard sealed the enemy's fate, forcing Aspen to finally surrender. The long war was over, and spring finally arrived over the battle-scarred kingdom. At a public ceremony, Marcus, the battalion commander, called 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 forward in front of everyone. He was handed a royal dagger, a symbol of honor reserved for the kingdom's greatest heroes. Standing on that stage, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 finally understood something he hadn't grasped before. A true knight needed more than strength. They needed honor earned through every sacrifice along the way. That night, the entire camp celebrated, drinking, laughing, and roasting each other without mercy. Even his oldest rivals, Andrew and Mac, finally departed to rebuild their fallen noble house. It was a bittersweet farewell, but a proud one, watching them walk toward their own dreams. Marcus had one final gift prepared, and it would change everything 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 believed about his future. He introduced a proto-knight named 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏, alongside a curious frog who could sense raw talent instantly. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 unleashed an aura of pure intimidation, and 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 felt death from every possible direction at once. Rather than retreat, he forced himself forward, refusing to let instinct override his dream. That single act of defiance stunned everyone watching, even a proto-knight who had seen countless soldiers before him. The frog studied him carefully and delivered devastating news. His talent simply wasn't enough to become a knight. To everyone's surprise, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 didn't break, didn't cry, didn't even slow down. He simply asked what came next, refusing to accept impossible as a final answer. The frog explained something called will, the true power separating knights from ordinary soldiers. It wasn't strength or skill, it was the raw force of a mind refusing to break. Very few people could ever awaken it, and no one could explain exactly how it worked. Fascinated by his stubbornness, the frog, named 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, decided to stay by his side. She wanted to study the strangest human she had ever encountered, up close, every single day. Even his own squad admitted his growth had somehow slowed, hitting a wall none of them could see past. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 only smiled, insisting he was still moving forward, just in steps too small for them to notice. Not long after, danger returned from an unexpected direction. Hired assassins from Aspen's crown, Jackson silently eliminated every hidden killer sent his way, protecting his captain without a single word of thanks needed. Behind the scenes, an enemy strategist named Abner realized his assassination plans had completely failed. He accepted defeat, promising they would meet again properly, on an open battlefield instead. Life at camp finally slowed, though 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏 never once let a single day of training pass by wasted. His squad noticed something strange, no obvious improvement, yet an unshakable happiness in everything he did. Jackson suspected he was improving in ways too subtle for ordinary eyes to catch. Then came a new mission from Marcus, wiping out a dangerous monster colony near a frontier town. Krisa insisted on tagging along, chasing rumors of hidden treasure buried somewhere nearby. The frog 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 joined too, translating ancient writings scrawled across a mysterious old map. On the journey there, monster after monster attacked them, far more than any normal colony should produce. Something felt wrong from the very beginning, though nobody could quite explain what. When they finally arrived, the town's watch captain, 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, seemed strangely hostile toward outside help. 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 sensed something dark clinging to one of his men, a soldier named Hugo. That instinct turned out to be correct, and far more dangerous than anyone expected. That night, Esther confided a painful secret. A lost love who once shared her happiness for swordplay. She promised to stand beside 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 for as long as he needed her. Then, without warning, the warning bells exploded across the sleeping town. A massive horde of monsters, twisted and mutated, surged toward the walls all at once. Hugo revealed himself as a cultist, worshipping a demon sealed away behind something called Devil's Gate. The entire town, it turned out, had been sacrificed as bait from the very beginning. Chaos swallowed the streets whole, and 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's squad scattered to hold every possible entry point. 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 burst through a wall, hunting cultists with a fury born from years of buried grief. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 carved a path through the horde, protecting terrified villagers with every ounce of strength he had. Then the colony's leader stepped forward, faster and smarter than any ordinary beast should ever be. A single poison strike dropped 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 to his knees, blood pouring from his mouth. He tried to crawl forward anyway, refusing to let this be the day. He finally stopped. The boatman's voice echoed in his mind, asking what one man could possibly do against so many. 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 woke up again, sword already in hand, before the sun had even fully risen. He questioned 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 about the cult, piecing together fragments of a threat far bigger than one town. The moment he stepped outside, The horde was already tearing through the streets once more. This time, he moved without hesitation, cutting a path straight toward the villagers trapped in the open. Every lesson from every loop before this one poured into his blade, all at once. Heart of the beast, let him dodge 7 blades at once, turning enemies against each other. Jackson's hearing training let him catch a scream behind him before he even saw the danger. A whistle dagger flew true, saving a stranger's life in a single perfect throw. Odan's brutal training let him crush monsters with his bare hands mid-swing. For a moment, it almost felt like the villagers had a genuine chance of survival. Then the colony leader spotted him from across the battlefield and pointed its blade directly at him. Every remaining monster turned at once, converging on a single target, a single obstacle standing in their way. The watchmen around him began to panic, weapons trembling, feet already turning to run. 𝗕𝗙𝗓 felt the crushing weight of death pressing in from every single direction at once. The boatman's voice returned one final time, warning him softly that this might finally be his limit. But 𝗕𝗙𝗓 had heard that same warning before on 100 different battlefields, in 1,000 different lives, and every single time, he had proven that warning wrong. So he tightened his grip on both swords, one forged from his own sweat, one earned from a fallen rival. He thought of Rem's laughter, Agnes' silent pride, Jackson's quiet loyalty, Odan's unshakable faith. He thought of Esther curled against his chest, and a frog who refused to leave his side. He thought of a village elder's charm, a joke that became the greatest gift of his life. Limits, he reminded himself, were never something to fear. They were simply walls waiting to be climbed. And 𝗕𝗙𝗓 had never once found a wall he was willing to leave standing. So as the horde closed in, as death pressed against his throat one more time, he refused to accept it. He planted his feet, steadied his breath, and raised both blades toward the coming storm. Whatever happened next, he decided, he would meet it standing, not kneeling. Somewhere behind him, 𝗕𝗓𝗓 screamed his name, terrified this might finally be the end. 𝗕𝗙𝗓 didn't turn around, didn't hesitate, didn't slow his stride for even a single heartbeat. Because a man who has already died 1,000 times understands something most people never will. Death was never his enemy, giving up was. And giving up simply wasn't something 𝗕𝗙𝗓 knew how to do anymore. The horde surged, and every watchman around him broke and ran. But 𝗕𝗙𝗓 planted his feet and did not move an inch. Poison still burned through his veins, yet his grip on both blades stayed steady, steadier than it had any right to be. He thought of the 12-year-old who once broke his sword and his pride in a single strike. Back then, running away had felt like the only option left. Tonight, running never even crossed his mind. Somewhere behind him, 𝗕𝗓𝗓 screamed his name, certain this was finally the wall that would end him. 𝗕𝗙𝗓 didn't turn around, didn't answer, didn't slow his breathing for even a second. The colony leader charged first, confident this fight was already decided. 𝗕𝗙𝗓 met that confidence with silence. The same silence he'd carried through 1,000 smaller deaths. Whatever came next, he had already decided how he would meet it. On his feet, blades raised, eyes open. Because death had taught him exactly one lesson worth keeping. It only wins if you let it. Somewhere across that burning town, Rem was fighting his own fight. Laughing the way only Rem could laugh in the middle of chaos. Ragnar was cutting through the dark with the same clean, wasteless strikes. He drilled into 𝗕𝗙𝗓 one bruise at a time. Jackson moved through the shadows without a sound, the way he always had, protecting people who would never even know his name. Odan stood over a group of villagers like a wall of muscle and prayer, daring anything to get past him. None of them had been born for this. They'd simply refused to stop, exactly like the man who dragged them all here. Esther watched from a rooftop, hissing at her own helplessness, wishing her curse would finally let her be enough. And somewhere in the smoke, 𝗨𝗡𝗏𝗏 tore through cultist after cultist, chasing a grief she'd carried since long before she ever met him. A boy who was once mocked out of a bar for dreaming too big had somehow built a family out of misfits nobody else wanted. That, more than any sword technique, was the real weapon he'd spent his whole life sharpening. The colony leader's blade came down, fast and poisoned, and certain. 𝗕𝗙𝗓 didn't dodge this time. He stepped straight into it. closing the distance the only way he knew how. Every lesson from every death poured into that single step. Rem's timing, Ragna's balance, Jackson's focus, Odon's raw strength. He caught the blade an inch from his throat, and for the first time all night, the leader's eyes showed something other than hunger, fear. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 smiled through the pain and told it the same thing he'd told the boatman 1,000 times before. That day would never come. He drove forward with everything the loops had ever given him, and the fight that had felt unwinnable a moment ago finally felt like just another wall. Not an easy one, never an easy one, but a wall, and walls were the one thing this man had never learned to fear. Whatever happened in the next few seconds, he already knew one truth, that no monster, no curse, and no loop could ever take from him. He hadn't survived 1,000 deaths by being the strongest man on any battlefield. He'd survived by being the one who simply refused to stop getting back up. A farm boy laughed out of a tavern, for dreaming of knighthood was now the reason an entire town still had a chance to see morning. His friends weren't fighting for a title or a reward. They were fighting because somewhere along the way, his stubbornness had become theirs too. That's the real story underneath every battle in this tale. Talent, not fate. Just a heart that never learned how to quit. Every commander who once dismissed him eventually watched that same dismissal come back to bite them. Every rival who once called him weak eventually became one more wall he climbed over. And every wall still waiting ahead of him, whatever shape it takes, will meet the exact same man. They always do. Bruised, outmatched on paper, and utterly unwilling to fall. Because somewhere between his first death and this one, 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 stopped being just a soldier chasing a dream. He became proof that a dream, chased hard enough and long enough, stops being a dream and starts being who you are. That was the day the world finally understood something his enemies had learned the hard way. Over and over again. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 was never going to stop. The colony leader staggered back, blade arm trembling, blood mixing with the poison, still dripping from its own weapon. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 pressed the advantage, driving forward with both swords working in rhythm, one guiding, one striking. He remembered Ragna's voice from 100 sparring sessions. Trim away wasted motion, and any enemy will show you an opening. The leader tried one last desperate lunge, and 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 read it before the creature had even finished pulling back its arm. His blade found the gap under its collarbone, and the fight that had haunted this town for days ended in a single clean thrust. The creature dropped, and with it, the horde around it seemed to lose whatever twisted order had been driving them. Without their leader, the mutated gnolls scattered. Easy prey for a squad that had already survived far worse than this. Rem finished off the stragglers near the west gate, grinning like the whole fight had been a personal favor. Ragna cut down the last two near the square without breaking his usual bored expression. Jackson reappeared from nowhere, as always, wiping his blade clean like nothing about tonight had bothered him at all. Odon knelt beside the survivors, checking wounds, muttering prayers under his breath for the ones who hadn't made it. By the time the sun rose, the streets were quiet again, littered with proof of how close the town had come to disappearing entirely. 𝗕𝗏𝗚𝗡 knelt in the wreckage of what he'd built, staring at a wall his people had trusted with their lives. He hadn't known about the cult hiding inside his own watch, and that ignorance would haunt him far longer than any wound. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 didn't blame him. He'd learned long ago that trust was a wall too, and sometimes it broke before anyone saw the crack forming. Hugo's body was found near the rear gate, and with it, proof of exactly who had sold this town to something waiting behind Devil's Gate. 𝗨𝗡𝗏𝗡 stood over the ashes of the cult's hidden shrine for a long time, saying nothing at all. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗓 didn't push her to speak. Some walls, he'd come to understand, weren't his to climb for her. She finally turned and said only that her lover would have liked him, in that same stubborn, reckless way of hers. He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, and for once, that was enough. Chrysa, still shaken, admitted the treasure map could wait for another trip, preferably one with fewer monsters attached to it. Penn arrived with reinforcements not long after, furious she'd missed the fight, and even more furious the fight had happened without her. Word of the cult reached Marcus within days, and for once, Even he seemed unsettled by what a small frontier town had almost hidden. He sent word up the chain that Devil's Gate needed watching more closely than anyone had bothered to watch it before. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 didn't know it yet, but that report would open a door leading to walls far taller than anything he'd faced so far. For now, though, there was only the long road back to border guard, and a squad that hadn't stopped bickering since the moment the danger passed. Rem complained the whole way that he hadn't gotten to fight the colony leader himself. Ragna told him to be grateful he hadn't, since Rem would have just charged in and made everyone else's job harder. Jackson said nothing, which somehow annoyed Rem more than any insult could have. Odon offered to bless everyone's boots for the walk home, and everyone, without exception, told him not to bother. Esther curled against 𝗕𝗏𝗏's chest the entire ride, still recovering, still refusing to admit how much she'd worried. When they finally reached camp, the rest of the platoon was waiting, exactly as promised. Rem's first words were a demand for a rematch, as if no time had passed at all. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 laughed, actually laughed. The kind of laugh that came easier now than it ever had back in that mocking tavern. That night, the squad ate together, argued together, and slept under the same worn-out tents they always had. Nothing about it looked like the beginning of a legend. It just looked like a group of people who'd chosen each other over and over. And maybe, 𝗕𝗏𝗏 thought, that was exactly what a knight's order was supposed to feel like in the first place. Marcus called him in a few days later, congratulating him on a job well handled, though his eyes carried a heavier question than his words did. He asked carefully whether 𝗕𝗏𝗏 intended to keep chasing knighthood even after being told outright it might be impossible. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 answered without hesitation, the same way he always answered that particular question. Impossible just meant nobody had found the right wall to climb yet. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded, the way a man nods when he stopped trying to argue with the truth. Lua Garnet, still traveling with the squad, admitted she still couldn't explain what made him different from every other soldier she judged. Maybe some things, she said, weren't meant to be measured by talent at all. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 didn't need her approval to keep training, but hearing it changed something quiet in the way he carried himself. Anyway, summer rolled into the border city and life, for a short while, actually felt steady. He trained every morning, same as always, rebuilding what the last mission had worn down. Vengeance still challenged him to duels he rarely won, though the gap between them had narrowed more than either liked to admit. Torres still teased him about his age, still lost more duels than he won, still called him a monster every single time. Penn still flirted just to watch him get flustered, and he still never quite understood when she was joking. The ferry commander still called herself his fiancée, and he still hadn't found a way to make her stop. Somewhere in all that noise, 𝗕𝗏𝗏 realized his life had quietly filled with people who refused to leave his side. That realization hit harder than any sword strike ever had. A boy who once left his village, believing he'd have to become a knight completely alone, had built something else entirely instead. Not a solitary hero, a family stitched together out of misfits, rivals, and one very opinionated frog. Every wall he'd climbed so far had brought one of them closer to him, not farther away. Maybe that, more than any title, was the thing worth fighting for in the first place. He still thought about the frog's words often. Only 1 in 10,000 ever learns to awaken their will. He didn't know yet what shape his own would take, or when it would finally show itself. But he'd learned patience the hard way, one death at a time. And patience was no longer something that scared him. Some nights he dreamed of the boatman standing quietly by his lantern, waiting for a conversation that never quite finished. He always woke from those dreams the same way, sword already in hand, ready before his eyes had even opened. Esther used to tease him about that habit. Lately, she'd stopped teasing and started sleeping a little closer instead. Autumn would bring new orders, eventually, new borders to guard, new enemies who hadn't yet learned what his name meant. Abner was still out there, still planning, still promising a rematch on a battlefield of his own choosing. The swamps of 𝗕𝗏𝗏 were still licking their wounds after losing 5 assassins to a single silent soldier. Whatever came next, 𝗕𝗏𝗏 knew it wouldn't be gentle, and he'd stopped expecting it to be. For now though, There was only training and food, and the sound of Rem and Ragna arguing over absolutely nothing. There was Odon's terrible jokes about God, and Jackson's silence, that somehow said more than words ever could. There was a frog who studied him like a puzzle she refused to stop solving, and a curse-bound woman who'd started calling this place home. It wasn't the life a mocked farm boy could have imagined back in that tavern, sword arm shaking, dream already halfway broken, but it was his life now, built one impossible day at a time, one loop, one death, one stubborn choice after another. Late one evening, sharpening both blades by the fire, he thought back on everything that had brought him here. The retired mercenary who first saw talent in him, the strangers who laughed him out of a bar, the boy who broke his sword at 12, the war that trapped him in an endless loop of dying and waking, the friends who never asked why he kept getting back up, only how they could help. None of it had been easy. None of it had felt fair, not at the start, and not most nights since. But sitting there, blade in hand, surrounded by people who trusted him with their lives, he understood something simple. Every wall he'd broken had cost him something, and every single one had given him something back worth far more. He thought about the word night, and what it had meant to him as a boy, and what it meant to him now. Back then, it meant power. It meant ending wars alone, standing above everyone else, untouchable. Now, he wasn't so sure that version of the dream had ever been the right one to chase. A knight who stood alone wasn't strong. He was simply isolated, and isolation had never once made anyone unbeatable. The knights he respected most, the ones who had actually earned that title, carried people with them, not just swords. Asia had told him his limits were clear, and that awakening his will was rare beyond measure. She hadn't been wrong, but she also hadn't accounted for one thing that no frog's instinct could ever fully measure. A man surrounded by people willing to die beside him didn't need to awaken his will alone. He had a whole squad willing to help him find it, one duel, one lesson, one shared meal at a time. Rem often said 𝗕𝗙𝗏 was the craziest person he'd ever met, and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Ragna said much the same thing, in fewer words, usually right before challenging him to another sparring match. Jackson never said it outright, but he kept showing up, kept teaching, kept protecting without asking for thanks. That was its own kind of language, and 𝗕𝗙𝗏 had learned to hear it clearly by now. Odon believed some higher purpose had placed 𝗕𝗙𝗏 in his path, though he never claimed to fully understand why. 𝗕𝗙𝗏 didn't need it to be fate. He was content just knowing Odon had chosen to stay. Esther still refused to admit how much she cared, hiding it behind complaints about his reckless training. But she stayed, night after night, curled against his chest, quietly making sure he'd survive to see another sunrise. 𝗨𝗡𝗏𝗏𝗡 studied him with the scholar's curiosity that had slowly turned into something closer to loyalty. She still called him untalented. She still stayed anyway. Andrew and Mac were gone now, chasing their own dream of rebuilding a fallen house. But their gratitude had never left him. Somewhere out there, House Andrew Gardner was rising again, brick by brick, because one lunatic captain had believed a nervous boy could lead. Torres, Penn, and even the ferry commander had all in their own strange ways become part of the same stubborn orbit around him. None of them had planned to end up here. None of them regretted it either. Sitting by that fire, sword finally sheathed, 𝗕𝗙𝗏𝗏 allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He wasn't a knight yet. He might not be one for years, if ever. No matter what, the frog's instincts claimed. But he was no longer the boy who got laughed out of a tavern for dreaming too big. He was the boy who kept dreaming anyway, loud enough that the whole world had finally started listening. That, he decided, was worth more than any title stamped by a royal court. The fire crackled low, and somewhere in the camp, Rem's voice rose again. Already picking a fight with Ragna over something trivial. Odon told them both to calm down. Jackson ignored all of it completely. Esther groaned and buried her face deeper into 𝗕𝗙𝗏𝗏's side. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly familiar. Exactly the kind of noise he'd once thought he'd have to earn a knighthood alone to deserve. He hadn't needed to be alone at all. He'd only needed to keep standing long enough for the right people to find him. Tomorrow would bring new training, new orders, and eventually, new walls taller than anything he'd faced before. He welcomed all of it, the same way he'd welcomed every death, every failure, every impossible morning that came before. Because a man who has already survived his own death 1,000 times over has very little left to fear. And a dream chased that hard, for that long, through that much pain, stops being a dream somewhere along the way. It becomes simply who a person is. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘 closed his eyes that night, knowing exactly one thing for certain about the road still ahead of him. Whatever wall came next, he would meet it, standing, blades ready, family beside him. And whatever the world called him, spellbreaker, lunatic, weakling, or some knight, he would answer to all of it the same way, by getting back up, one more time, exactly as he always had. That was never going to change. Not for monsters, not for magicians, not for gods hiding behind gates no one dared open. It was simply who this farm boy had become, one loop, one loss, one stubborn choice at a time. The fire eventually died down to embers, and the camp finally quieted for the night. Somewhere in that silence, Esther's breathing steadied, and 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘 felt his own shoulders loosen for the first time in days. Rest never came easily to a man who trained every waking hour, but tonight, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stay, it came anyway. Tomorrow, the sword would be back in his hand before the sun even cleared the hills. Tonight, he allowed himself to simply exist, scarred, exhausted, and entirely, finally, at peace. That peace wouldn't last forever. It never did, not for a man carrying a dream this big. But for one quiet night, it was enough. And 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘 had learned by now not to take a single one of those nights for granted. Somewhere past the border, new enemies were already planning their next move, unaware of exactly what waited for them. Somewhere past the horizon, taller walls than anything he'd yet faced were already forming, patient and unhurried. 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘 didn't know their shapes yet. He didn't need to. He'd learned long ago that walls revealed themselves in their own time, and every single one had fallen the same way so far. Not through talent, not through luck, through refusal, plain and simple, repeated until it became unstoppable. That refusal had carried a mocked farm boy through 1,000 deaths and out the other side. Still breathing, still climbing. It had turned a curse into a classroom, an average sword arm into a weapon feared across 2 kingdoms. It had turned strangers into family, and a broken dream into something the whole battalion now shouted from the stands. Spellbreaker, lunatic captain, the man who wouldn't die twice the same way. None of those names had come easily. Every single one had been earned in blood, sweat, and one more morning of training. And whatever name history eventually settled on for him, night or otherwise, one truth would always sit underneath it. He had never once waited for the world to believe in him before he started believing in himself. That belief, stubborn and unshaken, was the real inheritance he'd carry into every battle still ahead. It was the same belief that once got a boy laughed out of a bar for dreaming of ending wars with a single blade. It was the same belief that later broke curses, killed magicians, and forced werewolf alphas and greyhound captains alike to kneel. It was the belief that had, slowly, and without him even noticing, built him an entire family out of soldiers who'd once been strangers. And it was the belief that would carry him past whatever wall history still had waiting for him. Because a heart that refuses to break can climb absolutely anything placed in front of it. Every scar 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘 carried told that same story, not in talent, but in refusal. Every friend beside him carried a piece of that same story too, changed forever by a leader who never once gave up on them. This is the story of 𝗕𝗙𝗚𝗘, the weakest soldier in the weakest squad, who simply refused to accept that word as final. A man who died more times than most soldiers ever fight, and stood back up exactly that many times in return. A man who turned an endless curse into the sharpest tool he ever owned. A man whose dream, once mocked in a filthy village tavern, now echoes across battlefields on both sides of a war. He is not a knight yet. The story doesn't end with a crown or a title placed upon his head. It ends, for now, with something far more lasting, a family built from nothing, and a will that refuses to bend. Somewhere ahead, more walls are already waiting, taller and colder than anything he's faced so far. And somewhere ahead, 𝗕𝗙𝗏𝗘 is already sharpening his blades, ready to meet every single one of them. This is the story of a boy who was told he'd never be enough, and who spent every single day since proving that wrong.